Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Cultural Intelligence in the Workplace. My name is Deanna Caldera with CultureAmp. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're going to get started in a few minutes. We'll be talking about cultural intelligence at work, so as soon as you're settled, we'd love to get this conversation started. One of the ways we'll be interacting is by using the chat feature in the Zoom. And throughout the next hour, we'll be asking you to go back to that chat to have that conversation with us. If you're looking for it, just hover over to your Zoom window and you'll find it in the lower right. For starters, we'd love to know about you. What's your name and where are you dialing in from? Amazing. So why are we all here today? We would love to know what cultural intelligence means to you and how that manifests in your organization. For anyone who's willing to share, please jump in the chat and let us know. Awesome. Before we dive into our discussion, I just want to quickly introduce us. CultureAmp is a people and culture platform that we make easy to collect, act, and understand on employee feedback throughout the entire employee lifecycle. We have over 2,500 customers globally. Sapling is a people operations platform that helps growing organizations automate and elevate their employee experience. ThinkHuman is a leadership development and manager training company that drives lasting change and habit formation in companies such as SoulCycle, Snapchat, and Spotify. Now I'm going to hand it over to Meredith, the CEO at ThinkHuman, who will be leading our discussion on culture intelligence in the workplace. Welcome, Meredith. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Deanna. Thank you so much, and welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you here today, and I'm looking in the chat, seeing people from across the planet. So great. We have an incredible panel of experts here with us from high-performance organizations that are sharing their road-tested experiences and stories and taking your questions all about cultural intelligence. So a few tech items to start. In the upper right-hand corner of your window, you should see a button for either speaker view or gallery view. If you click on that, you can either see one face big when that person is talking, or you can see all the faces the whole time. So you can see all panelists at once should you want to. And then, as many of you are already in the chat, just want to make sure that if you haven't already gotten in there, click on that chat icon button and let us know you're here. And please get involved in the conversation. This is not TV. This is an interactive dialogue, and we want to hear your questions and comments in the chat. So before we dive in, let me quickly introduce this awesome panel that we have. And panelists, if you could just wave when I say your name so people know who you are. We have Latoya Lynn, Senior HR VP at Compass, a hypergrowth real estate tech platform that helps everybody find their place in the world. We have Lois Jeffers, lead D&I consultant from EY, a global company with over 10,000 employees reaching across the globe. Natasha Kehimkar, Chief People Officer from App Annie, a global company that has offices in Asia, North America, Europe. And then we have Ken Matos, Director of People Science from CultureAmp. So all of these amazing leaders are here from high performance companies. If you haven't already, check out their Glassdoor scores of these companies. They're all doing something really special. And again, please get involved in the conversation and submit your questions using that chat button at the bottom of your screen. So let's get started. With over 7 billion humans across the planet speaking over 6,000 languages, cultural intelligence is what enables us to be effective working across cultures. And that can mean working with other cultures across the globe or even among cultures in our home country. It can be that key to opening up new thinking and new markets and new possibilities. So let's start broadly, panelists, with context. What is cultural intelligence? What do you mean when you say it? And Lois, if you would be willing, let's start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So cultural intelligence, in short, it's really the ability to relate to, work with, and communicate effectively with people from different cultures. So what that really translates to is really having a level of self-awareness around how you navigate different cultures, the ability to interact with people from different cultures, understand the behaviors and nuances, the habits, different work styles, speaking styles that exist within different cultures, and ultimately not ascribe negative perceptions or assumptions to individuals or within a specific culture based on the differences that show up in how you interact, work together in the workplace.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lois. Ken, anything you'd add? And all of you panelists, I'm going to ask you to chime in. So Ken, you go next.
Yeah, I think Lois hit it pretty much on the head. When I'm talking about cultural intelligence, I'm really thinking about people's ability to be aware of their own assumptions about what behavior means, whether or not what somebody did implies they respect you, they like you, all those things that we learn when we're very young within a particular context, which that doesn't necessarily mean in a different part of the country, a different part of the world, those same symbols mean the same thing. And so we are culturally intelligent when we're able to recognize that our set of symbols are not a universal set, and to be open to learning what is the frame someone else is coming to us to, and finding a common ground where we can both communicate what we're really thinking and feeling without there being misunderstanding because of these cultural languages.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Thank you so much, Ken. How about anything you would add, Latoya?
Yeah, I mean, I think both Lois and Kent really hit it on the head. And also, hi, everyone across tuning in. So excited to explore this concept with everyone. But I think for me, just echoing Lois, echoing Ken, I'm sure Natasha's going to say something brilliant right after me as well. But I think just for me, it's really holding cultural intelligence to the same standards as emotional intelligence, and really kind of carving out that this concept in order so they can actually point to it, right? Because I think now we've done a lot of work, we can really point to emotional intelligence, someone who isn't really or is or can develop it. I think what I want to be able to explore and create a pathway towards during this conversation and obviously beyond is, you know, building that same pathway for cultural intelligence, so people can kind of understand that this person is or isn't, and they need some development, and what are the key areas they need to really work through. So that's what I'm really looking to explore.
Love it. And Natasha, anything you would add?
I'll just build on what everyone else has said and say that it encompasses a willingness to go beyond the surface, a desire to dig in beyond the obvious, and a curiosity to explore, well, how does that land? How does that work? And how do I fit into that context, as opposed to having others fit into our context?
Yeah, so also beautifully said. So thank you to everybody. Latoya, I just want to make sure you saw the note from one of the community members saying that they can't hear you well. So if there's anything you can do about that. And just to synthesize some of the big takeaways I'm hearing from you all is, instead of making quick, fixed mindset judgments, relying on stereotypes, bringing curiosity and humility and agility. So like EQ, where we have attunement and empathy for others' emotions, with high cultural intelligence, bringing attunement to norms and values of different cultures, and using that attunement to interact with empathy. So let's then talk about why this matters. Why is this important in business? And Latoya, if you would be willing to jump in first.
Yeah, I mean, it matters really. I mean, this is such a passionate thing for mine, because it really matters, especially, you know, as people working in organizations. You know, we really need to understand what, and let's take it from a business standpoint, like, you know, we need to make sure that we are culturally understanding our clients. We are making sure that we're building product and assessments and tools or whatever that we're using, or marketing, whatever it is that we're producing as a company, to have the right connection culturally. We've seen in a lot of instances, very big top companies really missing the mark on really understanding cultural intelligence. An example of that is Gucci, and Burberry and H&M a couple of years ago, really not understanding cultural intelligence, and, putting people of color in very derogatory and very terrifying experiences with some of their products because they just lack the ability of cultural intelligence. So I think it's really important that as, HR leaders or business leaders and managers internally, to really have that lens whenever we push anything out. Now, internally, we need to also be able, and I know that my colleagues here on the panel will share this in much more detail, but as far as like really understanding, like, how do you make sure people have a seat at the table and they're heard and it's actually being applied and there are results, right? So there's that aspect of making sure that their culture is being taken to it in consideration, to where they can have space to feel they can be who they are and really shine within the workforce.
I'll just add a very kind of selfish perspective, and that self-centered perhaps. It's enriching. It's interesting. It makes us more interesting human beings when we know more about other parts of the world and the way other cultures work. It's fascinating, and it sort of helps us build a sense of creativity, and that curiosity, it sort of compounds upon itself, and it's enriching. For me, it's fun.
Yes, both those things. Ken?
One of the things that I find is that we often overthink it a bit, and we always apply it to these big frames of different countries, but we use it every single day just with people who grew up in different families, where there's different norms for respect. I grew up in a family, my father was blind, and so I spent a lot of time guiding him, reading things to him. I was very used to being part of conversations that when I went to other places, it's like, no, you're a child, sit down and be quiet. And I think we apply and experience this on this granular level, and it just gets bigger and bigger when we start applying it to different cultures and regions in the world. It's not distinct from something that people are using every single day, but it is a place where we may not realize it's happening.
Yeah. I love that, Ken. I was going to just build on everything all the panelists have shared. When I think of our organizations, it's not just, as many of you mentioned, it's not just about external, it's internal, and we're working with people from many different backgrounds and cultures. And I think as organizations today, we are really committed to creating environments where there is this sense of belonging, where everyone feels a sense of belonging. And I feel like cultural intelligence is really a vehicle or path to getting there, right? And I think what the research tells us is that when people feel this stronger sense of belonging, they're more likely to stay with organizations, they're more likely to be creative, to be innovative. And one of the ways we can really create this greater sense of belonging is by really empowering and encouraging our people to be more culturally intelligent, right? That means that they understand the value of different perspectives and ideas and backgrounds, and not just understand the value of it, but they really begin to leverage it, right? And understand how it can help our teams perform better, help us from an individual learning perspective, but also what we put out to our clients and our different stakeholders. So I think it's incredibly important in our organizations to focus on this piece, this cultural intelligence piece.
So in this, was somebody going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to jump. There was a question here that someone reached out. I think was really important. I think Raj, Summer, thank you so much for that question. It just says, can cultural intelligence be simplified? And it's so like, how can you start? Like, what are the next phases on that? And it's such an interesting question. I don't really have the direct answer to that, but I feel like this is something that we should think about, what can people do to even start having those conversations?
I love it. And I will take Raj's question, which I also have even more granular, to say if I'm hearing you all right, what the values we're looking to embed, some of them include curiosity and being adaptive, of other cultures. So how do we set the organizational norms to be curious of other cultures, to be adaptive of other cultures? So thoughts from any of you panelists on how we do that?
You know, I think norms, this idea of norms, I think it begins like with creating this foundation, right? Is it, you know, what is it as an organization that we stand for, right? What is it tied into our mission statement, into our values? Is it embedded in everything that we do and say as an organization, right? And once it's embedded in, I think, those core things, our mission statement, our values, our leaders speaking about this on a day-to-day basis, this is when you begin to see the norms around culture intelligence, belonging, I think, really begin to take root in organizations. And then you have to start to think about where are there gaps, right, in our processes, our procedures, how we are learning, the things that we are doing internally. But norms, I think, starts from the foundation, like who are we as an organization, beyond just making profit for our stakeholders, but what do we stand for? What's our purpose, right? And if it's aligned to, I think, those things, you begin to, I think, see the norms develop around cultural intelligence and related topics.
Great. So I hear, Lois, just to synthesize what you're saying to make sure I understand, that if you want to start to embed this, it needs to be embedded in some very basic places like mission, values, and leaders speaking about it. And I just want to make sure that I'm even understanding you all, or if there's dissent, speak up, but understanding, right, that the things we're talking about embedding are curiosity for other cultures, humility about our own culture, and adaptiveness or a nimbleness. Are we, like, is there some agreement among you panelists that those are some of the key factors? Is there anything that's really critically missing or doesn't belong in that list?
I think this may fit into the curiosity concept, but I think just being willing to explain why. I think a lot of what creates cultural intelligence problems is a lack of time. And so people are so busy trying to rush to completion of a conversation or an effort that when they hit a bump, they immediately interpret the cultural miscommunication as somebody being disrespectful, trying to get in my way. And so they go into a win or lose mindset, and then it becomes a fight as opposed to, wait a second, let's just clarify this. And so I think there's a willingness to invest that has to be there as well. Otherwise, you can teach everyone all the skills and they'll have them in their head, but they won't ever use them.
Yeah, what that makes me think, Kenneth, and I'm not sure if I'm really digesting this right, but what it makes me think is that it's not just about how much we know about someone else's culture, because we could learn a lot of things about someone else's culture, but bringing an openness to being wrong ourselves, and maybe if I hear you right, like assuming positive intent from someone else, or maybe just not assuming negative intent. So just like an open curiosity, like I'm not sure what that meant, but let me investigate further, rather than that kind of quick lurch to judgment and assumption. And so am I hearing that right?
Yeah, I absolutely think that the key is just allowing the facts to be facts. Somebody said something, somebody did something, and then being willing to ask, what was the reason behind that? What's the thinking behind that? Was there a symbolism there that I missed? And then if you realize, oh no, they really were being disrespectful or fighting me or something, then you can have that conversation. But I think a lot of times that's not really what's happening, but we go there and then it becomes a self-perpetuating fight.
Yeah, and it seems like, oh, go ahead, Natasha.
Curiosity demands a suspension of judgment, which is really hard for us as people. Like, it's just difficult to set judgment aside as we interact with the world around us. I'm an adoptive parent. My husband's Chinese Hawaiian. I'm an Indian Jew. Our children are South Korean adoptees. And we had to go to cross-cultural training when we were adopting. And it was about what it feels like to be the only non-Caucasian in a setting, which is ironic because my husband was one of 5 Asians in his high school. I was the only non-white person in my entire school life up until end of junior high. So it was rather amusing and somewhat frustrating to have to go through this training as part of our path to adoption. But one of the things that I found most fascinating was a story that one of the social workers shared, and she was an adoptive parent, I think, of an Ethiopian-born child. And she said, you know, when people ask me a question that at first kind of gets my back up, I ask in return, why do you ask? For those who are, excuse me, for those who are truly asking an intrusive, rather rude question, they usually step away. And for those, and it ended up being for the most part, with people with a genuine curiosity. Oh, my niece is adopting, or I'm thinking of adopting internationally. I don't know where to start. And it was the start of a dialogue that was coming from a very genuine and non-judgy place. And that simple question of why do you ask was an invitation to dig in further. And it was hard for her, she said, to train herself to do it. But I found that question to be incredibly powerful. And it helps me avoid getting my back up when I get a question like, oh, how is that possible? Well, okay.
Yeah, if I can also add to that, I think, you know, what I'm hearing and what I feel is that it is that sense of curiosity. And also, you know, I think there's a question asked, like, what are the first steps? I think the first step is that, is actually, you know, putting that into practice and actually just being curious and asking clarifying questions, and understand that maybe some questions that, you know, sometimes people refrain from asking questions that they don't know something about because they don't want to offend, or they're concerned about that. But if it comes from a very genuine place and you get feedback on, like, this is what it is, I think, you know, you can definitely do that. And I think it also kind of bridges over to self-awareness, right? How aware are you within your own cultural differences and norms and what makes sense for your own life, and also not making that the more dominant approach to all things. And just understanding that people are different, you know, and this is, you know, from a ethnic background, religious background, even personality, introvert versus extrovert, like anything you can even think of, you know, and just not taking the assumption that your way is the right way to get something done, and that should be the norm.
So good. I just want to call out some of the key themes I'm hearing, just because they're flying by so fast and so good. So firstly, Latoya, something I'm hearing from you is, I would call humility. I don't know if that's quite how you would call it, but relating to our own norms and interpretive frameworks as like a norm, but not the norm, and recognizing that. And also that intersection of curiosity and humility, where even when we ask a question, even if it's well-intended, knowing the difference between impact and intent, and instead of justifying ourselves if we offend, taking responsibility for, I may have offended, and being genuinely apologetic and responsible for having that impact, even if it wasn't our intent. And that in that, you know, if we want to call it humility bucket, that personal responsibility is in there for that difference between impact and intent. And then Natasha, a couple things I heard in what you said that I just want to highlight. Number one, that even as an adoptive parent of children from other cultures, and you and your husband's life experiences, that there's really no end point of stretching ourselves as it relates to cultural intelligence. It's not like, oh, I'm the winner, or check, I got this. It's like there's just always further for any of us to take ourselves with growth mindset in this domain. And then also something I heard in what you said, Natasha, was curiosity about ourselves, and assuming, being curious that we might have done something wrong, and that's okay, not to feel badly about it, but curious about others, and also curious about ourselves. So I just wanted to highlight a few of those key themes. And Lois and Ken, if there's anything you wanted to add before we jump to the next question, the chat is like on fire with new questions. Yeah.
I actually want to respond to a question. Carmen Ramirez is asking, how are each of you leading with this behavior and practices within your organizations as people leaders? And so I think one of the key things that I always try to remind people of is that there are obstacles to actually doing these things. So, and one of the key obstacles is having the time in your schedule to stop and ask questions. People are usually in too much of a rush to actually engage in the behaviors that we're describing in this call. And I see that manifest across departments in my organization. So someone else commented in the chat about how these cultural differences aren't just racial or regional. Sometimes they're just sales to people science, which exists in my own organization, where sales lives in a quarterly schedule. They have a lot of assumptions about how do we hit our numbers, how do we do that within a certain period of time. People science is much more focused on clients who already are working with us and how we can support them. And so we live on a yearly schedule. And so when you have a conversation across those two sets of assumptions, things can really get heated or blow up. And so one of the things that I always try to remind my staff of is, what are the assumptions that the other group is coming to us with about how their world works? And then look at ourselves. And that makes it so much easier to be like, oh, if they're assuming this and I'm assuming this, of course there's a disagreement. Let's get those assumptions on the table and negotiate what is most applicable for both of us, rather than assuming they're rushing us or they don't respect our time or our process.
So how do we embed that in an organization as a practice, whether it's between departments, whether it's understanding another, whether it's a vendor or a partner, understanding their culture, whether it's a foreign, whether it's another country? How do we embed this idea of noticing our assumptions, surfacing what are our assumptions and what are their assumptions, and then stepping into the other person's world? So thoughts on how we...
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. For me, it starts with the company culture, their mission, their values, and what an organization deems to be very important to them. And then a conversation around that, layered in on, like, does that have a connection to how we look at things from a cultural standpoint, right? How do we approach things? Who's invited, who's not invited? Are we taking into consideration of how people digest communication versus not? Like, everything you can really think of when it comes to how an organization builds its own culture. And that, like, that's the first step. And I think another practical way to kind of really step that out very directly is really allowing space for people to take a deep dive in their own personal norms, what they deem to be culturally appropriate, and then have a debate about that and come to some type of understanding of, this is where the groundwork is. And I think doing that work really creates an opportunity to become more culturally intelligent.
Yeah, and just following up on that, the work piece, right? I think if there are opportunities for organizations to embed some type of learning or training, whatever word you're comfortable using within your organization, one of the tools that we use, it is by an organization, and I hope I'm getting this right. It's called GlobeSmart, and it is a tool, an assessment where you can, we use it with teams, and the way it works is that individuals can assess where they fall on different dimensions around how you relate to authority, how do you relate to teams. It's based on sociocultural scientists, and then you can also see where your team lies, falls within that dimension. And really the sweet spot, right, is understanding the gaps that happen between where you lie on that spectrum, where another individual lies, and where your team lies, because the work happens within those gaps, right? That's where the assumptions are being made based on, because if you think that someone is, rude because they're speaking up more, or in a meeting, then you would typically speak up in a meeting. Or if you think someone is aggressive because of a specific behavior, but it's really based on a cultural norm, you're more likely to make, judgments or assumptions about this person. You're less likely to want to work with them. And then that impacts the team and also you as an individual, right? Because you miss out from learning on working with that individual. So I think there are opportunities to embed learning, and there are many different tools out there that you can utilize. So that's one way that you can do it, and it's something that we do with different teams. And I've also taken it from a practitioner perspective. I think it's important as you are leveraging these tools to understand where you lie, and it's really interesting. It's always interesting to see where you lie on these spectrums, because you think of yourself sometimes as lying, being at a certain level, and then you recognize, oh, wait a second, I also have to step back and look at the assumptions that I'm making about different individuals or different teams. So that's definitely something that I would recommend organizations look into if possible.
Okay, so in terms of practical things people can do, one is assessments, and there are a bunch out there. You mentioned, is it Globe Smart, Global Smart?
Globe Smart.
Globe Smart. Okay, so there are assessments. And then Latoya and Ken, I think you both spoke about giving space for examining norms and noticing our own norms. Yes, Latoya, the space, looking at our own norms and looking at others. And something, I think it was Raj, someone in the chat pointed out that there is real value in noticing the differences, but also in celebrating the commonalities and giving gravity to both to celebrate our differences and that universality among us to bring us closer. Other practical, oh yeah, go ahead, Ken.
I think one of the things that waylays this conversation is it gets elevated to an ethical and moral place too quickly. And that's not to say there isn't a large ethical and moral component to it, but I think there's a lot of smaller scale, much more focused on business results conversations you can have that can get people practicing the skills before it gets to the big place where people can feel really threatened. So for example, someone who's highly culturally intelligent will probably be better at change management because they're better able to understand why some people are resisting the change. What does the old state mean to them and what does the new state mean to them? And be able to explain things in a more engaging fashion rather than sort of forcing it onto them. Negotiations is another place where it's hard to negotiate with someone if you don't understand where they're coming from. I was working with someone who I found exceedingly rude in a negotiation process. He was just like ripping everything I said apart. And afterwards, someone pointed out, like, I believe he's Israeli. And I was like, wait, don't they have a culture for haggling? And then I realized what was probably going on is he thought I was coming in with overinflated statements of what we could do and was trying to find truth, which is part of haggling. In my case, I was coming in with the best offer at the beginning and was shocked that he was ripping it apart in such a dismissive sort of way. And that was a reminder of a business negotiation that could have gone completely off because I was taking something personally. And so I think when we can repackage it and here are all the skills you just need to do your job and you're using this constantly, it becomes a lot less threatening than if you start framing it in the are you a good person conversations that it so often just gets sucked into so fast.
Well, and this is the challenge, and Ken, you raised this a bit earlier, that of time, right? That we don't allow ourselves time to digest and process. And we jump so quickly. It happens so fast. You know, I was introduced to the amygdala hijack idea 2 decades ago, and it's finally landed with me. Like, I can tell better now when it's happening. And it's really hard to recognize that that person may have been bringing a culturally something to the conversation that there was no malintent whatsoever, but it made you feel a certain way. Well, his behavior was one approach, and how much of your feeling do you actually own, right? So but we don't allow ourselves that time. And so one thing I do in my one-on-ones now with my directs, I think a couple of them are maybe on this webinar, is and they designate when, but we do a coffee talk. So one's in Beijing, one's in the Netherlands, and it's other than the computer being up to look at each other, we're not taking notes. We're just sitting there with a glass of water, cup of tea, whatever it is, and having a conversation. Usually it's about a tougher topic, but it allows us to get into the nuance. I wish I had started this practice ages ago. I really do. And so I found myself relying on maybe some social situations, which can get complicated when your caregiver, parent, or elder care considerations become complicated. But when I'm visiting another market, I try to at least find some time where we're not in the office. So maybe it's just go out for coffee instead of having the one-on-one in the office. There's something about changing the environment that allows for that more space. And it takes maybe a little longer than a normal one-on-one because you're walking to and fro or getting transportation from one location to another. But there is true benefit in allowing yourself the time and to be cognizant that we jump very, very quickly to a perspective that may not be real. It may not be accurate at all.
Yeah, and I think I just love how you put it, Natasha. I think making these assumptions, sometimes tricks us up, and then we become somewhat of a deadbolt. We're not making progress, and we're not kind of pushing through. And something that I've done with some of my business partners and my leaders that I work with, especially when trying to build relationship, is exactly what you described. I take them on long walks by water or to a park. And we just have it just really just changes the space and the scope of the conversation. And I think it really brings to how we behave within organizations. If something happens to us as human beings, when we walk into a building where we work at and the norms of that culture and what that should look like versus coming outside of the building and really being a human and understanding what those needs are. There's something that happens. And I always find that people are less guarded, more revealing, and more open to hearing and listening. And going back to Ken's original challenge of putting that out there for us is time. I feel if you take the time to do that in the beginning or at some point, then everything else kind of speeds up, right? Then you kind of have a cadence with someone. There's rapport that's built. You can kind of understand them a little bit better and can learn and grow with each other, from those instances. So yeah, I totally can understand and agree with that.
So for the people in the chat, for anybody who's not looking in the chat, lots of great resources are being put in there. I want to make sure people are seeing those. There are some, just to call out some of the big things I'm hearing. If we're looking for embedding new ways of being in the organization, we've got how do we get people motivated to do that? And Lois talked about setting the organizational norms, putting it in the values, having leaders talk about it, having leaders model it, put it in the mission. And then there's the cognitive components of having people understand something different. And there are all these assessments that people have put into the chat, and now a bunch of them are in there of different assessments where it's not right or wrong or good or bad, but just where you can see on a spectrum. And then also in that somewhere between, I think, cognitive and emotional zone is making space for real dialogue and learning about one another, learning about one another's assumptions, learning about our own assumptions, recognizing they are assumptions, and making space to investigate ourselves and others. So other thoughts, panelists, on practical things? Oh yeah, go ahead, Ken.
Oh, I was gonna say, one thing that also I think is important from a practical perspective is having good cultural awareness doesn't mean you necessarily do what the other person wants. Cultural intelligence is about being able to understand what the other person's drives are, what your drives are, and hopefully negotiating some overlap. But it doesn't mean automatically, well, I just do what the other person wants, which I think is the fear that a lot of people at organizations have, that once they recognize something, they have to bend to it. And I think really connecting it to a real conversation about conflict management and negotiation helps turn away some of that fear and say, well, no, now that you know it, you can do something with it, but it doesn't necessarily mean just capitulating.
And that's where a book that helped me a lot along the way, I read it the first time and went, oh, great book. And then I read it the second time and it changed my life. It was Crucial Conversations.
Oh yeah, I've heard that.
But it's really, really good. And it talks about psychological safety and recognize when to step in and when to step out of a conversation when it stops being dialogue.
Something that jumps at me as well, a way to kind of really hit it from a practical standpoint, and this is a little bit off of the workspace, but think about like if you're a parent or about to be a parent or have interacted with a child before that is, younger than 5 years old or so, I feel, and I used to be a babysitter in New York City, and the one thing that I have learned, the best training that I've ever had when it comes to this concept of cultural intelligence is with kids. Like they have no sense of who you are, your status, the reason why your color of your skin is one way versus another, your accent, what business norms you have, none of that. What they really want to understand is how well you can connect with them and how well can you understand them and hear them, and also vice versa. How well can you articulate to them to be able to understand? So if anyone wants to like practice in a safe zone, find a family member or your kid and kind of like really ask them questions about things and see how granular you need to be able to respond to them for them to understand. And I think that's just the most innocent and best way to really understand that approach of cultural intelligence, I think.
It really highlights for me, Latoya, that component of being adaptive or agile. So It's not just being curious and learning, but also being able to integrate what we're sensing and taking in how we then are interacting with somebody and applying it in the moment. A question has come up twice in the chat that I want to bring to the foreground, which is what's the interaction or relationship between cultural intelligence and D&I? And Lois, I'm going to send this question your way to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to break it down a little bit, right? What is D and what is the D and what is the I, right? Diversity, we think of diversity. I think in most organizations at this point, diversity is defined very broadly. It's all dimensions, not just race and gender, it's socioeconomic, sex, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, all of that. But we know that that's not enough in the workplace. So then that's where inclusiveness comes in, or inclusion. It's leveraging those differences to help people feel valued, recognized, and the sense of belonging. In my view, cultural intelligence is a vehicle that really drives D&I, right? At the root of cultural intelligence, it's ensuring that we are not allowing our assumptions and biases to get in the way of how we interact with individuals, get in the way of creating this inclusive workplace. So from my perspective, it's really this vehicle, right? And individuals who have higher levels of cultural intelligence are more likely to promote inclusiveness, to be inclusive within the workplace. So very much related and concepts, I think, that work in tandem with each other.
Love it. And I think what I hear you saying, Lois, and this is worth digging into for a minute, is that cultural intelligence is an access point to creating a more inclusive environment.
Absolutely.
And that it is learnable. It's not like somebody has it or doesn't, but It is something that any person from wherever we are can start to elevate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the term culture intelligence, it makes it seem like this big, and I think Ken mentioned this earlier, this big, scary term. And we sometimes describe like people who are more culturally intelligent or better or good, and people who aren't or bad. And it's not really about good or bad. It's really about taking the time to learn different ways of operating the workplace that create a better workplace for ourselves and the individuals that we're working with. It's something that is absolutely learnable and teachable, but there definitely has to be that desire, right? Intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, this desire to, one, understand your frames of reference, the desire to understand others' frames of reference. And I think some of that motivation can be really driven by the organization, right? The organization helping its people understand not just the benefit to the organization, but the benefit to the individual as an employee within the organization. And then there's just this idea of exposing yourself to different individuals and cultures. And by doing so, that's where you really begin to, I think, break down the silos that often happen with different cultures within organizations. And I think to someone's question earlier around the practical piece about culture intelligence, I think this is where organizations that have ERGs or professional networks, that create spaces for individuals within different demographic groups to commune and network, really, I think, encouraging everyone, regardless of backgrounds, to attend events, because it's such a great opportunity to learn about different perspectives and experiences of different individuals. So that's another great way, I think, of really pushing this practical piece of how do we get people to increase their level of cultural intelligence through exposure within the workplace.
Yes, and I would like to highlight, Lois, that it's impressive to me that an organization of the size of EY, I think if I remember right, you told me there was an event on hair, and the speaker come in and talk about hair and how it's perceived by different cultures. I mean, that's getting real. It can look like it doesn't have an immediate business application, but I bet everybody in that room felt differently about each other after that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it definitely speaks to this like intersectional nature of these topics and the importance of having these type of topics, not just within, I think, the specific group. And that event was,
you're good.
Co-sponsored. Oh, am I still here? Okay. My laptop is doing something crazy. So the importance of bringing groups together of different backgrounds. So it wasn't just sponsored by one specific network. It was co-sponsored by different networks. So which really, I think, really spoke to the importance of the topic, but it also encouraged people from different backgrounds to come to this event and just learn a little bit more about a topic that maybe they may not have to challenges around in the workplace, but understand that their colleagues may have different challenges around in the workplace. So definitely these types of topics, I think, are really important to touch on within the workplace.
So Yasmin has a question here in the chat from earlier that on this point of intersectionality and the crossroads of different cultures. Yasmin's question is, how can we celebrate the diversity of our employee population in a respectful way without singling out any one culture? And how can we acknowledge and accommodate different religious holidays in our policies? So Natasha, I'm gonna send that your way first, if you're okay with that.
Sure. I was very fortunate to work in an organization. It was about 100 people when I joined, maybe 200 when I left. And people, they started some grassroots work to celebrate their holidays that mattered to them. So when Diwali came around, many of the Indian employees, they went out to stores, local stores, or cooked at home and brought sweets in. We had the caterer they asked, and we had the caterer serve Indian food that day, and we decorated, and it was just a way to share the experience. There was the Persian New Year was coming up, and we had a number of the leaders were Persian, and one of their spouses set up a table with a special cloth and special foods and certain items to highlight what was important in their culture around their New Year. And it was really very, very special because it was grassroots. And I spoke with a company recently that they have ERGs, and I know ERGs, there are questions about ERGs and the value, and we're not going to get into that right now, but their ERGs were homegrown. So they were employee initiated. And that's what made it most special. And it made it much more sticky than anyone forcing or saying, okay, congratulations, we're now starting an ERG. We're going to start a women's group. It was homegrown, employee initiated, and it became very innate and a very important part of their culture. One thing I will mention, and there's a question in the Q&A here about whether this is a very Western-centric concept. And I would say with a big no, wholeheartedly no, I don't think it is. This is something that we are working in a global organization now. I am. Many of us on the call are. If we didn't have cultural intelligence and there wasn't that desire to expand ourselves and the way we think and the way we look at the world, it would be very, very, very awkward. When we were working on a new vision for our culture and a new set of values, one of the things that came out in our markets was that we are global. We appreciate that we bring different perspectives and we amplify those perspectives. Those words are not mine. Those are words that were on whiteboards in our markets. Not my words. I didn't craft the word amplify. That came out of Singapore. When I think about this, to the extent that we're able to draw out our employees' voices and get them to articulate what matters to them and have them initiate things, usually people aren't doing things to hurt each other's feelings and to cause, ill will. It's coming from a place of genuinely wanting to celebrate something or understand or explore. So I think we also, at least in my world, in the people ops world, we can be really tight-fisted on some of this stuff. We can be really hardcore and like, this is the way we're going to do it and this is the path. We also need to loosen up a little bit in our roles and really allow people to explore, and we can put around the lines where you can color however you want, stripes, polka dots, I don't care. But we also have to lighten up a little bit.
Ken and Latoya, I see you both want to say something.
I would disagree slightly in that I think different cultures would value this skill differently. So one of the things I think often happens with cultural intelligence is when you do realize that there's a difference, if you're from a culture that values winning over harmony, then you're immediately going to go to, all right, how do I make sure my culture becomes the one that we follow? Whereas if you're one that values harmony and individuality and connectedness, then cultural intelligence is a great skill and you're going to lean into it. And so I think it's useful regardless of the culture you're from, especially if you're talking to anybody different. But I think the willingness to engage with it, the willingness to see it as a value, I think that is very much influenced by the culture you're coming from.
Yeah, so I want to add to that. So Ken is an IO psychologist, and that's what my background is. Natasha is an HR practitioner and a leader, and that's what I am today. So I'm toggling between both of them on this one. So I'm glad Ken went first. So I think it depends. And I think we also need to be very clear that we should be okay with it depending on a particular situation and how we want to approach things. I am a big believer that one size does not fit all situations. And I think with the right assessment and the right cultural intelligence on the situation, we should be able to make a draw between either one. I think something that really comes up for me, I think this is going back to your earlier question, Meredith, where you asked, I think bringing culture and talking about it and how do you bring that into the workspace, and you talk about like different like Indian cultures and things like that. I think asking permission is okay. I think that is something that we need to be comfortable with and not make an assumption. That's something that we should either take on or not take on. I think we need to ask people permission, if this is something that we can do. And I want to tie in Lois's hair situation. People ask me permission if they can touch my hair or not. And it depends on the situation if I left them or if I don't. So it's like everything always depends, but we need to really ask those very specific questions.
All right, so we are sadly getting close to time. So I want to ask two more questions quickly. One is regarding leadership accountability regarding this. So we had two questions, at least two questions come up about this. One is, can you have cultural intelligence in your organizations if your leaders lack it? And the second question was, how do you create accountability for leaders around this? So any thoughts from any of you about that? Either part of the question, whether it's, can you have it if the leaders don't have it? And the second part is, how do you create accountability? You can answer either part. Lois, I'm calling on you. Oh,
Yeah, leadership accountability is always a tough one, right? I think if we had leadership accountability, many of these challenges would not exist, right? And I think that is, for most organizations, that's what we're really striving for, not just leadership accountability, but leaders driving accountability within their direct reports and throughout the organization. So, I mean, I think in terms of driving leadership accountability, I do think this is where HR practitioners, D&I leaders play a really huge role. And oftentimes, I would say HR leaders and D&I practitioners are really lockstep with leaders, right? If an organization typically has these roles, there's typically a leader who has bought into the importance of these topics and the importance of building a culture that is culturally intelligent and diverse and inclusive. In terms of accountability, I think sometimes it's recognizing that people are in different points of their journey. And as practitioners, it is our role to help them get to that place of accountability, right? And sometimes we have to push them a little bit further and harder to get to that place of accountability. But I think it's first sort of asking, helping them to build their awareness around the importance of these topics. Many of the organizations, many of you are sitting in organizations where some of these things are already embedded in the mission, the values, and the statement, and vision and mission statements. So it is helping the leader understand the tie to the business objectives, the overall, the business impact of cultural intelligence, D&I, and having real honest conversations around, this is where we are from like a current state perspective, this is what the research tells us, and this is where we want to be. And helping bring them along that journey. It's not something I think that can happen overnight. And I think when you begin to have those honest conversations around current state, this is where we are, this is what we're saying we do, but there may be gaps in who we say we are and what we're doing. And as a leader, it is really your role and your responsibility to help bring the organization along. I think having those honest conversations can really begin the dialogue around accountability, right? Because people are in different points of their journey. And it takes different, sometimes modes of action or to really drive them towards that accountability piece. But if you're working with a leader, I think, who doesn't recognize the importance of accountability, I think starting first with this conversation around business impact and self-awareness, whether it is giving them, resources, taking them to different events within the organization, having listening sessions with people in the organization to help them sort of understand the desire and the need for these type of initiatives or efforts. So that was a little bit long, but.
Great, Lois. Thank you so much for taking the hard question. The big thing I heard in that was helping with raise self-awareness and elevate buy-in before you can get to the stage of accountability.
Yeah.
So with 2 minutes left, a question for all of you amazing panelists. If people in this community are going to come out of this webinar and do just one thing, just one new practical action, what's the one thing you'd suggest? And Natasha, let's start with you.
I'm going to revert to something I mentioned earlier, and that's use that question, why do you ask?
Love it. LaToya?
Yeah, I think for me is just two things. Really, one is, ask yourself and take responsibility for your own responsibilities on how culturally intelligent are you, right? And what does that even mean for you, and define it. And I think a way to pressure test that is, and this is something I got from, I live in Brooklyn, New York, and a very wise person told me, you have to be able to have a conversation with the guys on the street corner just as well as you have a conversation with people at the executive table. And you need to be able to have something to say to people all in between around that. And that's the way to pressure test your ability to understand how culturally intelligent you are.
Love it, LaToya. All right, Lois?
I was going to say something similar to Latoya, just building upon that. How do we as practitioners in the space continue to educate ourselves and continue our learning in this space? I think sometimes we also have similar blind spots that we may not be aware of. So I'm constantly looking for new research, reading articles on HBR, continuing to think of new and creative ways to bring these ideas to my organization. So I would just encourage everyone to continue learning.
Love it. And Ken?
I would say speak to the people around you and ask them, how do they show respect and common cause with others? I feel like those are the two places where cultural intelligence fails most spectacularly. And if you're going to do no other part of it, just being able to know how to show respect and common cause to a variety of other people will get you the time, will get you the resources and the opening to be able to have the deeper conversations, because people will believe that you have positive intent and everything else is just a learning process.
Thank you so much. We are on the hour. I am so grateful to you, incredible, incredible panelists. Thank you for sharing your experience, your wisdom to this community that is so alive and on fire in the chat. Thank you for your amazing contributions, for your fantastic questions, and go make your version of this real in the world. And thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.